Okay, here we are. Welcome. This is my vlog day 43 entry, but it's going to take a look at the cue for the intro of Japan that I wrote for SharedPlanet. This was a project for River Road that myself and Robert Neufeld, the other composer on this project, worked on a couple years ago, and I wanted to show a more in-depth look at the cue and how I built it up and, my approach. And so for this cue, it started with some temp music that when they did their rough cut, this had in it. And this was at the beginning of the project when they were still looking for the sound and the feeling. And so it sort of started with this simplistic but well-known, I guess, like Japanese taiko drumming song that's been in a lot of media. And so it had a mood, and I started watching it, just sort of seeing the tempo of how it was cut. But I started seeing lots of motion and other activity in this, and I really felt like I could bring a lot more dynamic movement. There was narration, so the idea of also still staying out of the way of the narration, but further connecting to kind of the movement of the assorted images on the picture. And so my initial approach, let's put that up there, go back here, was to break down the smaller sections within what I was looking at and find the kind of rhythm and tempo of those parts. And so essentially there was the introduction and then arriving to what I felt like was the first moment of action. So I started by just moving in on this little area.
Countryside into big cities like Tokyo. Countryside.
So I wanted to start introducing percussion and still sticks. I listened to, my process in this project was often to go to YouTube and sort of start listening to folk music and the traditional musics of the different countries where this project had gone, and then try and feel what the often it was like the instrumentation, like what kinds of instruments were part of the kind of folk, worldy, earthy sound of that particular country and community. And then how I could integrate those color palettes into the kind of emotional landscape of the story. And so here it was about creating this busyness feeling of bustle and the Japanese kind of scurrying ants feeling that often lots of images when you're first showing busy urban centers, it's often of footage in Japan. And I've been fortunate to go to Japan a couple times, and my friend brought me around to some of the very classic spots where some of these images were actually taken. So it was a real treat to kind of get to write some music across some of these images. So I started with sticks, and I had a nice instrument, a taiko ensemble, and one of the things you discover is that no one library actually has all the sounds you need, no one sample set. So it often became like listening to the different libraries and going, oh, I really like the sticks in this particular library, in which case it was these. And so with my keyboard, I basically played and inputted some sticks, and then I would go and further edit the velocities, and then I would also, in the main page, add a volume ramp because I'm wanting these sticks to slowly swell with the picture. And then I would go and I would look at the next section, and I know that I wanted the main beat to start kind of right as it switched from this scene into the start of the motion of people. And then I would loop a little area and start kind of just feeling what the rhythm of that area was. And you could see how it changes, boom and boom. And so I found the kind of main pulses of the picture changing, and it was finding the rhythm. And then kind of looping in, and I knew that all the people moving, I wanted to have sticks to kind of help convey that feeling of movement and busyness, with the larger drums kind of falling on the cuts of the different pictures, which as I would scroll through, you would see there's a change. And so I had a hit there. There's another change. And there was another. And this is the great thing of having a scroll wheel, to be able to just kind of move through slowly. And so then I would just loop that part, and I would either draw in, which often was the case with the sticks, and then sort of randomize them, or I would just play a bunch of drums from the keyboard that I have down there. And then I just would move to the next bar. And then I knew, for example, here, there was a little spot where suddenly there's this acceleration right through here, that little bit of motion. And so I would look at where that area was, and then at my different instruments that I had selected, I had either played, or I would then go and program in some extra And so I can just kind of soloing through the little parts where I would isolate, and I would like find some rhythms that worked with those sequences. I would also sometimes just drum out some rhythms and then go back and kind of edit into the picture the parts that I had played. So here's So that was another part to support that other rhythm, kind of hitting those larger picture changes. So this was the rhythm where when I got to this part, I knew that I wanted to hit that. And so I would like spend an hour, working on some little stick rhythms to further kind of hit that. I guess that's part of the same instrument. And so then that became... Okay, and so then I had some like rattles that I put in some effects and reverb to just kind of create almost the sound of what I imagined all that percussion in the city might sound like, bouncing off the buildings. And so I added another little subtle layer of that. And then, moving on. So this is another one where I knew that I wanted to get, these shots here with all the people moving. I really wanted to have like a bunch of little sticks really giving the motion to that movement. And then I also, years ago, recorded my dear friend Yasmin Amal, and she had this little frog, wooden frog, and so I have a sample of it, and so I played a bunch of samples of that kind of side by side to get double the speed. And so it's like a little memory of my sister Yasmin. And so I had this little rattle in there, and then it came back to hitting some main parts of the pattern. And so that rhythm at the beginning, I kind of introduced and felt like, oh, that might be the rhythm sound hook for this larger pattern. And then this was the sticks pattern. And so further going in and being able to play those notes, but then also develop velocity curves, as you can see this one right here, to really give that crescendo, as I also wanted to bring the rhythm up to when it hit these scenes, that it would be a release again. And so that became that part. And then I knew that I kind of wanted to hit so that when this shot here, it was sort of the way I had timed it out, would hit on the half measure or the downbeat. And so then I wanted it to suspend and have a little moment of space to kind of allow you to absorb all of that. And often is the case, I would be also paying attention to the narration and trying to stay out of the way of the narration in key spots. Or, as it's the case is now, it stops and then the narrator talks.
A third of the...
So it was about also paying attention to that dynamic and still trying to find the shape. And so for me, this was absolutely so fun. And when you get to work with incredibly well shot images and, you know, beautiful editing, like the cinematography just really inspires you to try and find the heartbeat of it and bring it alive. And so it's been a real treat. And so then continuing on, we knew that it was sort of And so I wanted to find also a pattern that would match this section, which is the infamous shot. So that became that part. And now we're introducing kind of the character that we've been setting up for this story and the arrival of the kind of emotional issue presented, which is this lady's experience of the franticness of the city right here, our character, and how we're going to introduce this kind of intensity and desolation and, you know, her emotional angst within this complex urban environment.
Thank you for trying the pitch wheel demo.
Well, I guess we're in my other machine here, and we've got a plug-in that is still in demo mode. That's hilarious. And so now we're introducing this character, so it's about slowing down and creating the emotional moment to soak into her feelings. And so this was a nice opportunity for a crescendo of these escalating moments. The narration is talking about her growing angst and challenges in the urban environment. And so this was a really fun part. I just sort of started trying to imagine that anxiety And I think this first little pattern really started with this string part. And so that kind of became the underlying anxiety layer, to which I started adding supplemental strings and these beautiful voices. This is one of the Spitfire Audio. They had this pretty cool plugin with these really interesting sound design vocals, and I felt like they really gave the mood. It just starts off simple, but then trying to add to the anxiety subtly. And then this other one, as we're now riding to this peak, we need some crescendo kind of sound. And so I had this sound and then started doing a pitch shift, which sort of brings us to the peak of this moment and this idea. Okay, like another layer that's kind of adding to the tension. And then I did also to add more grit, and often these cues as I'm working, and this is the great part of working with Robert, I might get it to a certain point and sometimes you can't see the forest for the trees, and then I would send it to Robert and he would listen and he's like, oh, that's really great, or I really like how this point here accents that. That's, maybe you could do this or that to further bring that out. I learned incredibly from him on the first project I worked on in National Geographic, really was this sort of pattern of when you're critiquing someone's work, how to sort of point out everything that you like and then suggest things that, could be done to improve it, rather than coming in and just saying, I don't like this and that doesn't work and this is no good. And so it creates a more positive kind of collaborative framework to keep rising to your best abilities. And definitely I've learned doing film music, there is a Buddhist kind of lesson of attachment that comes up. You can do something and ultimately, you're in service of the filmmaker, trying to help them with the vision of their film. And so you can have an idea, but sometimes it's not quite what the director wants and you have to just let it go and start fresh. And, initially decades ago when I was working, that was sort of a painful process. You put your heart and soul into this thing, you think it's great, and it's like, yeah, no. And I think sometimes it can even be just asking simple questions. It might have been because of the cowbell, let's say, in the cue that they didn't like, so they just don't like the whole thing. And if you had, asked some questions, maybe you could have saved something. But that's a really interesting part of this process that, so in the refinement, I think that's been really great. And so this might have even been a part where Robert suggested that, maybe it needs a bit more bite. Maybe this was my own idea, but adding suddenly some kind of guitar grit bite. And so then you start adding those things together. And so now I've done the kind of emotional landscape of her angst, but I'm still also trying to pay attention to the rhythm and the patterns that I set up before. And I also know where this scene is going, so I'm trying to set myself up and introduce the elements as we get ready for the next part of this story. So and now I'm doing the percussion to build as well. Oops. And now is the sort of introduction and arrival at the forest, where she's going to learn all about forest bathing. And we're now introducing the forest. I'm trying to create layers that are introducing, my own feelings of that harmony and that deep reverence and grandeur and softness and timelessness of the forest, layered with her own initial emotional tension. She's still carrying the residual urban city noise. And so I'm trying to maintain some of that anxiety. But as this journey proceeds, there's a fading of that and a resistance. And so it was really fun to kind of also find a way to maintain that simplicity and that reverence. And I thought this would be a really cool place to introduce, some Japanese flutes. I've collected some really cool recordings of shakuhachis. And so just trying to be very subtle, adding them as a nice textured layer in behind, bringing into the introduction of this, a nice little flourish. And then my favorite part here is now just this introduction of a beautiful organic pattern, just a simple, very subtly shifting, warm pattern. And I went to kalimbas and embiras to create this cascaded layer. And yet, as I wanted to still, amongst this layer, still keep that tension that she had that was still in the core. And I found this really great sound in Omnisphere that I kind of fiddled around with, that to me kind of still represented this. And as it sort of hides behind those other layers, it's still creating this tension. And so still some of those voices, and there was a bit of strings, the beautiful And so I was able to kind of continue that going, and slowly as the story shifts, it becomes more positive and more warm, and the forest and the lessons and the connection really have gelled. I'm not going to tell you any more about it because I really just urge you to go watch it. This is in the first episode that we had done, which was the episode called Forests. It's just such a lovely film, and the whole series is amazing. It's something I would encourage you to watch. And you could go to my website, sonicturtlemusic.com. Right on the front page, I've made a little link in a story, and you can kind of click on those videos and watch them. So I hope you enjoyed this little deep dive into a cue and my kind of process and what I did to help tell these stories. I would love comments. If you guys like this, share it. If you want me to do another one, like I had thought about a different cue, which was the intro to the Guatemala story with the elders and what they've been doing to protect their forests down there. And so I could totally do one there. I also had thought about the intro to New York in the cities episode. Like, I was very proud of the New York vibe that I was able to make in the story there. So if you're interested in that, maybe I could do a couple of those videos. I hope you're all doing well. Love you all. Stay fresh.